All right, hi kindergarten. So many of you are probably familiar with the book Rainbow Fish. It's an excellent book. I love the illustrations in that book, and the illustrations are the pictures. And now we've read the book together through the video, and now you get to create a rainbow fish. And we're gonna use some different techniques. We're gonna use something called salt resist. We're gonna use something called pastel resist, which you guys have done before. And we're gonna use something called wet on wet with watercolor, okay? Now, there are many different ways to draw fish. And if you wanna research fish with your parents and look up different types of fish, you do not have to draw your fish like I do, okay? If you wanna follow some of the techniques that I do, great. But if you have other ideas, I want you to use your own ideas, okay? So I'm gonna move my video camera down so you can see what I'm doing. We're gonna be using oil pastel to do this. And remember, I know I've said this 1,000 times, but oil pastel is different than crayon because oil pastel has oil in it and crayon has wax in it. Remember, oil pastel stains, so you do want to be careful with it with your clothes, okay? All right, so what you're gonna do is you're going to draw out your fish, okay? And again, you do not have to draw your fish like I do. We're all different artists with different styles, okay? But I am gonna draw some fins on my fish. And I'm gonna draw some nice big lips on my fish. And I'm gonna draw scales on my fish. Remember, scales are a form of visual texture. You can see the texture, but you can't feel it. Okay, so you make something look scaly, but when you touch the paper, it doesn't actually feel scaly. Now you can use multiple colors of oil pastel to do this, or you can use one color. It's your choice. I like to draw great big eyes so that there's no mistaking that that's the eye of the fish. Now, if you want to add some extra designs with oil pastel, like lines on the fins, or some little dots for detail, go for it, okay? I'm gonna actually color in his little lips. Now, once you've drawn your fish out, you're ready to add watercolor. So I've got my watercolor, I've got my water and my brush. Make sure your brush has a good hair day. Now, for this, one thing you're gonna need to grab from the kitchen is salt. But make sure you get your parents' permission first. Don't just go grabbing the salt. They might not want you to use it, okay? And if you can't do salt resist, not a big deal. At some point when you're back in the art room, you'll do salt resist with me, okay? All right, I am gonna start painting my fish. You can paint your fish however you want, but one thing I do want you to try is a technique that's called wet on wet. And I'm gonna show you how it works right now. So when you use watercolor, you're using a lot of water, and that's why it's called watercolor, okay? So wet on wet is where you put one color down Then you take another color and you do little droplets of the other color on top of the color you put on your paper. So this is called wet on wet. And the cool thing is you get to watch that color slowly expand and mix with the other color. Did you just notice that I just used two primary colors, blue and red? So what might happen is I might start to see some purple since I put those two colors together. That's kind of exciting. So I'm gonna show you one more time how I do the wet on wet. Now, you guys have done pastel resist before, okay? Remember, that's when you put watercolor on top of oil pastel, and the oil in the oil pastel resists the watercolor, okay? And so you can still see the oil pastel. So I'm gonna do wet on wet here again. I just put my turquoise watercolor down. Now I'm gonna put droplets of pink on top and watch it spread, okay? Again, this is called wet on wet, okay? Now I'm gonna show you the salt resist part. For this part, you're gonna want to use a nice big brush from your kit, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lay down my paint, okay? And then while it's wet, you can't do it when it's dry, you gotta do it when it's wet because it won't work otherwise. While it's wet, I'm gonna sprinkle some salt, okay? And then I'm gonna leave it alone. If I paint over it, it won't work. I'm gonna just leave it alone. I'm gonna let it do its thing, okay? But while I let it do its thing, guess what I can do? I can paint around it, okay? And if you wanna do some wet on wet in your background, you can do that too. I'm doing wet on wet here, okay? And then while it's wet, you put some salt on it. Now, I'm gonna show you ahead of time what happens. So here's a fish that I made inspired by the book Rainbow Fish. Do you see those little crystallization designs? They almost look like snowflakes. That's called salt resist. This is all called salt resist. And that's what happens when you put salt on top of watercolor and you let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes. It creates those designs. So salt resist you can do around your fish. Here on your fish, you can do some oil pastel resist. And throughout your painting, you can do some wet on wet. The only thing you don't want to happen is that you use so many different colors that you can't see your fish anymore, okay? So I used a variety of colors, but you can still see my fish here and here, okay? All right, my friends, I will answer any questions in Google Meet. But remember, you wanna paint your whole paper, all right? Also, just as a review, remember the shape of a fish is an organic shape because fish come from nature. Happy art making!